6 months after the confrontation at the Valderan border, Captain Jake Morrison stood before the United Earth government assembly, where representatives from every nation gathered to hear his complete report about humanity's first real diplomatic contact with an alien civilization that controlled vast territories and possessed technology that exceeded Earth's capabilities in many areas, though not all. The assembly hall buzzed with conversation as people took their seats and prepared to listen to details that would shape Earth's future policies regarding exploration and military development in a galaxy that had proven far more crowded and dangerous than anyone had imagined during the optimistic early days of faster-than-light travel. Secretary General Patricia Hammond called the session to order and invited Jake to present his findings, with emphasis on the treaty arrangements that had been negotiated and the implications for humanity's long-term survival among civilizations that measured their histories in millennia rather than centuries. Jake began by describing the journey to Valderan space and the tense confrontation with a fleet that could have destroyed the Defiant if combat had continued beyond the brief initial exchange that left 3 alien frigates disabled, but convinced their commanders that humans were not easy prey. He explained the negotiations with Emperor Thovan and the resulting treaty that established clear boundaries between human and Valderan territory, with provisions for peaceful contact and dispute resolution through arbitration rather than immediate military action. The assembly listened intently as Jake outlined the communication protocols that would prevent future incidents like the destruction of the horizon, by ensuring that all vessels could identify themselves properly and make their intentions clear before weapons were employed. Ambassador Chung from the Chinese delegation asked about enforcement mechanisms, and Jake described the neutral arbitration process that both sides had agreed to respect, even though compliance would ultimately depend on mutual self-interest rather than any higher authority capable of compelling obedience. Ambassador Singh wanted to know whether other civilizations existed beyond the Valderan Empire, and Jake confirmed that according to Emperor Thovan, the galaxy hosted dozens of spacefaring species at various technological levels with complex relationships involving alliances and rivalries that humanity would need to understand as they expanded outward from Earth. This revelation caused considerable discussion because most people had assumed that first contact would involve a single alien species, not an entire galactic community, with established power structures and territorial disputes that dated back thousands of years. Jake emphasized that humanity's successful negotiation with the Valderan had established important precedents showing that Earth could defend itself when necessary, but preferred peaceful cooperation when possible, and would not submit to demands that treated humans as inferior beings. Secretary General Hammond asked what steps humanity should take next, and Jake recommended expanding defensive capabilities while simultaneously developing exploration and diplomatic vessels that would allow contact with other civilizations under less confrontational circumstances. He stressed the importance of appearing strong but not aggressive, because the Valderan and other powers would be watching carefully to determine whether humans represented potential allies or future threats that needed to be contained through military or diplomatic pressure. General Roberts from the United Military Command wanted assurance that Earth could defend itself if attacked again, and Jake confirmed that the Defiant had proven human weapons and shields could stand against alien technology, though sustained combat with a major power would still favor the side with greater numbers and industrial capacity. Dr. Lisa Grant added her perspective, explaining that the Valderan had offered to share certain non-military technologies as goodwill gestures, while expressing interest in human mathematical approaches and computer systems that apparently used different theoretical foundations than their own. The prospect of technology exchange excited many assembly members who saw opportunities for rapid advancement in areas like medicine and agriculture that would benefit Earth's growing population as humanity prepared to establish colonies beyond the solar system. Jake spent hours answering questions and providing details about every aspect of the mission, while emphasizing that the treaty with the Valderan represented only a beginning, not a final resolution of humanity's place in galactic affairs. He warned that future contacts with other civilizations might not go as well because not every species would be as pragmatic as Emperor Thoven, who recognized that fighting humans would be costly even if the Valdren ultimately won through sheer weight of numbers. The assembly eventually concluded with general agreement that humanity needed to maintain strong defenses, while pursuing peaceful expansion and diplomatic engagement with species willing to treat Earth as equals rather than subjects or conquests. As Jake left the building and stepped into evening air, he looked up at stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and reflected on how much had changed since. The horizon's destruction had shattered humanity's naive assumptions about galactic civilization. Ryan Hughes joined him commenting on the successful presentation, and Jake acknowledged that convincing politicians was almost as difficult as negotiating with alien emperors, though at least the assembly members spoke the same language literally if not always figuratively. They discussed whether the treaty would hold over time, and Jake expressed cautious optimism based on his assessment that the Valdren benefited from having stable borders and peaceful neighbors rather than constant military deployments to contain threats. Ryan worried about what would happen when human expansion eventually brought them into contact with Valdren territory again, or with other civilizations that might prove less reasonable than the Empire. Jake admitted the future would bring challenges, but argued that humanity had proven capable of handling difficult situations through combination of strength and diplomacy that earned respect without requiring submission to anyone. He pointed out that Earth had survived countless disasters and conflicts throughout history by adapting to new circumstances and finding solutions that allowed continued survival and advancement across the planet. Construction continued on new warships, incorporating lessons learned from the defense encounter with the Valdren fleet, and designed to be even more capable in future conflicts if peaceful methods failed. Engineers worked on improved weapon systems and defensive shields, while scientists explored new propulsion technologies that might give human vessels advantages in speed or maneuverability over alien designs optimized for different tactical approaches. Meanwhile, diplomatic training programs prepared personnel for contact with species whose psychology and culture would require careful study and patient negotiation to avoid misunderstandings that could escalate into violence. In the Valdren Empire, Emperor Thoven reviewed reports showing that humans had honored the treaty by remaining within their assigned territory and making no aggressive moves toward imperial space or interests. Intelligence officers noted, however, that human industrial capacity was expanding rapidly, with new shipyards and manufacturing facilities being constructed at pace that suggested serious commitment to building military power capable of defending Earth against any threat. High Admiral Korvath expressed concern that in 50 years, humanity might possess fleet strength sufficient to challenge the Empire if relations deteriorated and conflict became inevitable. Scholar Tivix argued for deeper engagement with humans through cultural exchange and scientific cooperation that would build relationships, reducing likelihood of future conflicts while allowing both civilizations to benefit from shared knowledge. Emperor Thoven decided to authorize limited cooperation programs that would allow Valdren scientists to study human approaches to various problems, while human researchers gained access to certain imperial technologies that posed no security risks. The goal was to develop mutual interests that would make war less attractive to both sides while gathering intelligence about human capabilities and intentions through observation of how they use shared knowledge across the galaxy. Other civilizations learned about humanity's emergence and began making their own assessments about whether Earth represented opportunity or danger to their interests and territorial claims. Some viewed humans as potential allies against the Valdren Empire, whose dominance they resented, while others saw a rising power that might eventually challenge their own positions in the complex web of galactic politics. Captain Morrison returned to the Defiant, which had been granted special status as a diplomatic vessel that would patrol the border region between human and Valdren space, ensuring that the treaty was respected by both sides. As he walked the corridors greeting crew members who had served with distinction during the confrontation that earned humanity's place among spacefaring civilizations, Jake felt pride mixed with awareness of the enormous responsibilities that came with being pioneers in a dangerous galaxy. He made a log entry reflecting on the 6 months since the treaty signing and noting that while peace had been maintained, the underlying tensions remained because neither humans nor Valdaran fully trusted each other despite formal agreements and diplomatic gestures. Jake acknowledged that the neutral station hung in empty space exactly halfway between the positions of the Defiant and the Valdaran fleet, where neither side held tactical advantage and both could observe the other without feeling immediately threatened by weapons that could fire across the distance in seconds if negotiations collapsed into renewed violence. 2 days of careful planning had gone into arranging this meeting, with both sides proposing security measures and discussing protocols, until finally agreeing on terms that satisfied their respective concerns about treachery or surprise attacks. During what was supposed to be a peaceful diplomatic exchange, Captain Jake Morrison checked his uniform one final time while standing in the shuttle bay with Lieutenant Commander Ryan Hughes and Dr. Lisa Grant, who would accompany him to meet Emperor Thovan face to face in a conversation that might determine whether humanity and the Valdaran Empire could coexist peacefully or were destined to become enemies locked in conflict. The shuttle detached from the Defiant and began the short journey across empty space toward the station that had been hastily constructed by the Valdaran using technologies that allowed them to assemble structures in days that would take human engineers months to complete with current capabilities. Through the viewport, Jake could see the massive alien warships, maintaining their formation like predators, waiting patiently for prey to make a wrong move that would justify tearing it apart. With concentrated firepower, the station's airlock cycled open, and the three humans stepped into corridors that were dimly lit by Valdaran standards and decorated in styles that reflected an aesthetic sense completely foreign to human sensibilities developed over millennia of cultural evolution on Earth. Emperor Thovan stood waiting in the meeting chamber, flanked by High Admiral Korvath and what appeared to be an advisor or scientist whose function was unclear but whose presence suggested the Emperor wanted multiple perspectives during this critical conversation. The Emperor was taller than Jake had expected, with elaborate markings covering his chitinous skin and 4 eyes that seemed to track multiple things, simultaneously giving him an unsettling appearance that reminded the captain that he was dealing with an intelligence that had evolved under completely different circumstances. Thovan spoke, first commenting on Jake's height in a way that might have been an insult or simply an observation, depending on whether the translation was capturing the full nuance of his words in a language that had developed without any human input. Jake responded with a human saying about the size of fight being more important than the size of fighter, which seemed to amuse or confuse the Emperor based on his expression, which was difficult to read without understanding Valdaran body language. Both parties took seats at the table that had been designed to accommodate their different physiologies, and the meeting began with Thovan promising to explain why the horizon had been destroyed 7 years ago. The Emperor described imperial protocols for handling unknown vessels that failed to respond to communication attempts in restricted space, and explained that defensive doctrine required elimination of potential threats before they could gather intelligence or launch attacks. Jake listened with growing anger as Thovan essentially dismissed the deaths of 200 humans as the unfortunate but necessary result of security procedures designed to protect the Empire from enemies who had nearly destroyed their civilization in past wars. The conversation became heated as both sides defended their actions and criticized the other's approach to first contact situations, with Jake arguing that humans believed in giving others chances to prove their intentions, while Thovan insisted that such idealism was a luxury afforded only to those who had never faced existential threats. Admiral Korvath intervened, pointing out that Earth's military would likely respond with similar caution if an unknown alien vessel appeared in their solar system, ignoring all attempts at communication. Jake wanted to argue, but honesty forced him to admit the point had some validity, because humanity would certainly be cautious about unexplained visitors who might pose threats to the homeworld. Dr. Grant asked whether the Empire was currently fighting any wars, and Thovan admitted they were not, but insisted that vigilance remained necessary because the galaxy contained dangers that could emerge without warning. The discussion shifted to future relations between humans and Valdaran, with Jake making it clear that Earth would not accept being treated as subjects or inferiors in any arrangement that might be negotiated. Thoven studied the humans carefully, seeming to assess their character and determination through observation of how they carried themselves and responded to challenges during the conversation. The Emperor acknowledged that humanity had proven more capable than initial surveys suggested, and that dismissing them as primitives would be a mistake given their demonstrated ability to advance rapidly when motivated by necessity. Jake pressed for concrete proposals about how the two civilizations might avoid future conflicts and establish boundaries that both sides would respect without constant military posturing. Thoven consulted briefly with his advisors before offering a suggestion that involved formal recognition of separate territorial zones where each side would remain without interfering in the other's affairs unless invited. The proposal was not an alliance or even a friendship, but rather an agreement to coexist peacefully as neighbors who respected each other's space and resolved disputes through dialogue before resorting to violence. Jake found the terms acceptable in principle, though he knew that diplomats and lawyers would need to work out countless details about enforcement mechanisms and procedures for handling violations or misunderstandings. Ryan Hughes asked about trade and cultural exchange as possibilities for building trust over time, and Thoven seemed open to those ideas but insisted that such cooperation would need to develop gradually as both sides learned to understand each other. Dr. Grant raised the important question of communication protocols and emergency procedures to prevent another Horizon incident if ships from either civilization encountered each other by accident in neutral space. Thoven agreed that establishing clear identification procedures and standard hailing frequencies would be essential to prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into violence. The conversation continued for hours as both parties explored various aspects of potential treaty arrangements and discovered areas where their interests aligned. Despite fundamental differences in culture and philosophy, Jake found himself developing a grudging respect for Emperor Thoven, who proved to be more pragmatic than the aggressive military commanders who had initially confronted the Defiant at the border. The Emperor likewise seemed to recognize that Captain Morrison represented a species with potential for either valuable cooperation or dangerous opposition, depending on how this first contact was handled. Eventually both sides agreed that they had established sufficient common ground for their diplomatic teams to develop detailed treaty language that would formalize the basic principles they had discussed. Thoven stood, indicating the meeting was concluding, and extended his appendage in an awkward attempt to mimic the human handshake gesture after his advisor apparently explained its significance. Jake grasped the alien Emperor's appendage carefully, knowing that this moment would be recorded in history books on both worlds as the point where two civilizations chose peace over war, despite every reason to remain enemies. The humans returned to their shuttle and began the journey back to the Defiant, while Jake reflected on how close they had come to disaster and how fortunate both sides were that cooler heads had prevailed. Ryan Hughes expressed relief that they had avoided starting a war that Earth could not hope to win against an empire with thousands of years of military experience and control over countless star systems. Dr. Grant smiled, pointing out that Jake had represented humanity effectively by standing firm without being needlessly aggressive and demonstrating that humans could be reasonable partners when treated with appropriate respect. The shuttle docked with the Defiant, and Jake made his way to the bridge where Lieutenant Karen Walsh had maintained position, exactly as ordered during the tense hours while the captain's fate hung in the balance. Jake ordered course set for Earth, knowing that his mission was essentially complete and that humanity would soon learn they had earned a place in the galaxy through courage and determination rather than submission to stronger powers. The view screen showed the Valdran fleet beginning to disperse as their commanders received orders to stand down from combat readiness and return to normal patrol duties. On Valdris, Prime Emperor Thoven reviewed recordings of the meeting with his advisors and concluded that the humans represented an interesting challenge to Imperial assumptions about how the galaxy worked. The Emperor ordered his diplomatic corps to finalize treaty arrangements while simultaneously directing military intelligence to monitor human space carefully for any signs of deception or hidden threats. Thovin recognized that this first contact might be remembered as either a wise decision to avoid unnecessary conflict or a missed opportunity to eliminate a potential rival. Before they grew strong enough to challenge Imperial dominance, only time would reveal which interpretation was correct, but for now peace had been chosen and both civilizations would have to live with the consequences of tea. Emperor Thovin paced through the war room where holographic displays showed the frozen confrontation at the border and the 3 damaged frigates drifting in space while the human vessel maintained position with all weapons ready for another engagement if the Empire chose to escalate rather than negotiate. The Emperor's 4 eyes burned with anger and confusion because in 3,000 years of Imperial expansion no primitive species had ever bloodied the Valdaran military in their first encounter and lived to demand respect as equals rather than beg for mercy as conquered subjects who understood their place in the natural order. High Admiral Korvath stood rigid before his emperor, trying to explain how a single vessel from a civilization that supposedly possessed only basic technology 7 years ago had disabled 3 Imperial warships in seconds using weapons that operated on principles the Empire had dismissed as inefficient centuries earlier when they developed energy-based systems. The intelligence reports from the original survey mission were being reviewed with increasing fury because someone had clearly misjudged the humans or failed to recognize signs that this species possessed capabilities beyond what their outward appearance suggested. Scholar Tivix nervously offered an explanation suggesting that humans had a cultural tendency toward rapid innovation when faced with existential threats, and the destruction of the horizon had apparently motivated them to advance their military technology at a pace that seemed impossible by normal standards. Emperor Thovin demanded to know whether the Empire could defeat this single human ship, and Korvath assured him that overwhelming force would certainly prevail, but the cost would be measured in damaged vessels and lost personnel, which seemed excessive for dealing with what should have been a minor border incident. The Emperor recognized that the situation had become complicated because destroying the human vessel now would provoke questions about why it took an entire fleet to eliminate one ship and might encourage other species to challenge Imperial authority. If they believed the Valdaran were not as invincible as their reputation suggested, Korvath recommended a different approach involving limited contact to gather intelligence about human capabilities while appearing to consider diplomatic options that would allow the Empire to assess whether these newcomers represented a genuine threat or merely possessed a few tricks that seemed impressive but lacked strategic significance. The decision was made to send a diplomatic vessel forward to establish communication and determine what the humans actually wanted beyond vague references to seeking answers about a destroyed ship that the Empire had eliminated years ago under standard protocols for handling unknown contacts in restricted space. Admiral Kelrus received orders to initiate formal contact using proper diplomatic channels while maintaining fleet readiness, in case the humans proved treacherous or attempted to use negotiations as cover for some kind of surprise attack. Jake Morrison watched from the Defiance Bridge as a single alien vessel broke formation and approached slowly with weapons, clearly powered down in what appeared to be a genuine gesture of peaceful intent, though everyone remained alert for any sign of deception. The viewscreen activated, showing a different alien whose ornate markings suggested higher rank or special authority within the Imperial hierarchy, and whose manner seemed more measured than the aggressive admiral who had demanded submission just hours earlier. Emissary Vorlin introduced himself as a representative of Emperor Thovin and immediately accused humanity of attacking Imperial vessels and violating sovereign territory in acts that justified military retaliation under laws that governed civilized conduct among spacefaring species. Jake countered that the Defiant had fired only in self-defense after being attacked without provocation, and that entering space to seek diplomatic contact did not constitute invasion or justify the kind of hostile response that had greeted their arrival at the border. The conversation focused on the horizon and its destruction, with Vorlin explaining that Imperial protocols required elimination of unidentified vessels that entered restricted space without responding to communication attempts which were apparently incompatible with human technology at that time. Jake felt anger rising as the alien casually described the deaths of 200 people as the result of standard procedures that treated unknown contacts as threats to be destroyed rather than potential friends to be welcomed, or at least properly identified before resorting to violence. Vorlon seemed genuinely confused by human outrage over what the Empire considered a routine defensive action against a vessel that failed to follow proper protocols for entering territory claimed by a sovereign power that had every right to defend its borders. The cultural disconnect was obvious as Jake tried to explain that humanity valued life and believed in giving others the benefit of doubt, while the aliens operated on the assumption that anyone unknown was hostile, until proven otherwise through submission to imperial authority. The emissary pointed out that the Empire had fought wars that nearly destroyed their civilization and learned through bitter experience that hesitation could be fatal when dealing with potential threats from species whose intentions were unknown. Jake acknowledged the logic but insisted that humanity rejected such paranoid thinking and would not accept being treated as criminals or invaders, simply for approaching another civilization in hopes of peaceful contact. The debate continued with both sides presenting valid arguments from their own perspectives but making little progress toward actual understanding because their fundamental values and historical experiences were so different. Dr. Lisa Grant spoke up, suggesting that perhaps both civilizations could learn from each other rather than allowing this first contact to define their relationship forever, based on a tragic misunderstanding that neither side had intended. Vorlon seemed to consider this but remained focused on immediate practical concerns about how to resolve the current situation without either side losing face or appearing weak to observers, who would judge the outcome and draw conclusions about the balance of power. Jake decided to take a direct approach, explaining that humanity was not seeking war but would not accept being dismissed or bullied by an empire that assumed its size gave it the right to dictate terms to smaller civilizations who possessed their own dignity and right to exist. He made it clear that the Defiant represented only the beginning of human expansion into space and that construction of additional warships was already underway back on Earth, where millions of people were committed to ensuring their species would never again be vulnerable to casual destruction by aliens who viewed them as insignificant. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and Vorlon understood that the Empire now faced a choice between making peace with humans, while they were still relatively weak, or fighting a war that might prove more costly than anyone expected. Jake offered terms for a meeting between himself and Emperor Thoven or someone with actual authority to negotiate binding agreements rather than continue exchanges with emissaries, who could only relay messages without making real decisions. He suggested neutral ground where both sides could meet face-to-face without military forces lurking nearby ready to turn negotiations into bloodbath if someone made a wrong move or said something that triggered violence. Vorlon ended the transmission without committing to anything, but Jake sensed that his words had been heard and would be reported to the Imperial leadership, who would now have to decide whether pride or pragmatism would guide their response. Ryan Hughes expressed concern that the captain had essentially threatened an empire capable of destroying Earth with concentrated military force if they chose to make humanity an example. Jake acknowledged the risk but argued that showing fear or weakness now would guarantee bad outcomes because the aliens respected strength and despised cowardice, which they viewed as evidence of unworthiness to exist as an independent civilization. The bridge crew waited in tense silence, knowing that their fate, and possibly the fate of Earth itself, depended on decisions being made by alien leaders, whose thought processes and values remained mysterious despite the translation technology that allowed basic communication. On Valdris Prime, Emperor Thoven reviewed recordings of the conversation between Vorlon and the human captain, noting the defiance and confidence that seemed unshakable despite the obvious military disadvantage. The Emperor recognized that Captain Morrison was not bluffing about humanity's determination to fight rather than submit, and that destroying one ship would not eliminate the threat if humans were truly committed to building more vessels and challenging imperial authority. Korvath argued for overwhelming military response to crush this upstart species before they could become a genuine problem, but other advisors suggested that making enemies unnecessarily was poor strategy when potential allies or neutral neighbors offered more long-term benefit. Emperor Thovan made his decision ordering arrangements for a face-to-face meeting with the human captain because understanding this species and their capabilities was worth the risk of appearing to treat them as equals even if that rankled imperial pride. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant watching the alien fleet ahead through displays that showed their positions and energy signatures with remarkable clarity, considering the distance still separating the two forces, and he knew that everything humanity had worked toward for the past 7 years was about to be tested in a confrontation that would determine whether Earth's children could claim a place among the stars or be swept aside like insects by civilizations that had conquered space while humans were still learning to make fire. The ship around him represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering and scientific achievement, incorporating every breakthrough that Earth's brightest minds could produce in the years since the horizon had been destroyed without warning or explanation by an alien force that seemed to view other species as either subjects or threats with no middle ground for peaceful coexistence between equals who might benefit from cooperation rather than conflict. Lieutenant Karen Walsh reported the distance to the alien fleet, while her instruments tracked their formation, which was clearly designed to present a unified front of overwhelming firepower that could vaporize the Defiant in seconds if they chose to open fire with all weapons simultaneously, creating a barrage that no shield system could withstand no matter how advanced the technology protecting the hull from incoming energy weapons. The aliens had been broadcasting demands for identification and submission, but their messages showed no indication they were receiving the diplomatic packages that Earth had prepared with such care, including information about human history and culture and intentions for peaceful exploration of the galaxy that would benefit all species through shared knowledge and mutual respect between civilizations that chose cooperation over conquest. Jake had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, rising through the ranks of Earth's unified military during a period when humanity transformed itself from a collection of competing nations into a single civilization focused on survival and advancement in a universe that proved to be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined when the first crude faster-than-light engines allowed ships to reach neighboring star systems. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Hughes monitored the tactical displays tracking every ship in the alien fleet and calculating firing solutions that would allow the Defiant to strike back if attacked, though everyone on the bridge understood that destroying even a few enemy vessels would not save them if the full fleet committed to their destruction with the kind of coordinated assault that military powers perfected over centuries of warfare. Jake ordered continuous broadcasting of diplomatic messages, hoping that eventually the aliens would understand that humanity sought dialogue, not combat, and wanted only to establish peaceful relations that would allow both species to coexist without constant fear of sudden attack from an enemy they barely understood. The alien communication finally came through with translation matrices establishing a common language framework that allowed basic concepts to be exchanged, even though subtle meanings and cultural references would likely be lost in the conversion between species that evolved on worlds separated by hundreds of light years. Admiral Kelris appeared on the view screen with his 4 eyes examining Jake with an expression that might have been curiosity or contempt, though reading alien emotions was nearly impossible without years of experience studying their body language and facial movements, which varied wildly between species depending on their evolutionary history. The Admiral demanded immediate identification and surrender of weapons, followed by submission to imperial authority with no room for negotiation or discussion of terms that might allow the Defiant to maintain its autonomy while still respecting the territorial claims of the empire that controlled this region of space. Jake responded calmly, explaining that humanity came in peace, seeking answers about the destruction of the horizon and hoping to establish diplomatic relations that would prevent future misunderstandings between their civilizations, but making it clear that Earth would not surrender or submit to demands that treated humans as inferior beings unworthy of basic respect. The conversation grew tense as Admiral Kelris insisted that Imperial space was sovereign territory, where the Emperor's word was law and any vessel entering without permission forfeited all rights to protection or consideration under the codes that governed interactions between civilized species who understood their place in the galactic hierarchy. Jake felt his patience wearing thin as the alien admiral continued, making demands without showing any interest in actual dialogue or negotiation, and finally, he decided that politeness was achieving nothing and a demonstration of strength might earn the respect that reasonable arguments had failed to generate. He told Admiral Kelris directly that humanity would not be boarded or disarmed and would defend itself if attacked, making it clear that while the Defiant was only one ship, it represented a civilization that refused to kneel before anyone regardless of their military power or territorial claims. The transmission ended abruptly, and moments later, the alien fleet began repositioning their ships into an attack formation that left no doubt about their intentions to use force rather than continue what they apparently viewed as a pointless conversation with primitives who did not understand the reality of their situation. Ryan Hughes reported weapons lock from multiple alien vessels as their targeting systems focused on the Defiant, calculating firing solutions that would allow coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm the ship's defenses through sheer volume of incoming fire. Jake gave the order to bring weapons online and prepare for combat while maintaining defensive posture that would clearly show the Defiant was responding to aggression rather than initiating hostilities, which might be important for any future diplomatic efforts if humanity survived the next few minutes. The alien fleet opened fire with plasma weapons that blazed across the distance between the two forces, creating brilliant streams of superheated matter that could melt through ship hulls like hot knives through butter if they connected with an unshielded surface. The Defiant's engines flared as the ship dodged incoming fire using reaction speeds that caught the aliens by surprise, because their vessels were larger and more powerful but also slower and less maneuverable than the human warship that danced between plasma bolts like a fighter evading enemy fire. Jake ordered return fire with railgun arrays that launched solid projectiles at relativistic speeds, creating kinetic impacts that punched through alien shields, which were designed to deflect energy weapons but offered little protection against physical objects moving at such incredible velocities. 3 alien frigates took direct hits and began venting atmosphere as their hulls ruptured from impacts that delivered more energy than their designers had considered possible from weapons that relied on simple physics rather than exotic energy manipulation. The alien fleet ceased firing immediately as their commanders struggled to understand what had just happened and how a single primitive vessel had disabled 3 ships before they could adjust their tactics to account for weapons that operated on completely different principles. Jake broadcast another message, making it clear that humanity had no desire for war but would defend itself with lethal force if attacked again, and offering one more chance for dialogue before the situation escalated into a conflict that would benefit neither side. Admiral Kelris stared at his tactical displays showing damaged ships and a human vessel that had proven far more dangerous than intelligence reports suggested was possible given their supposed technological level just 7 years ago. The Valderan commander realized that his emperor needed to know about this development immediately, because the humans represented either a threat that required massive military response or a potential asset that could benefit the empire if properly managed through diplomacy rather than conquest. Jake waited on the bridge of the Defiant, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether humanity had just made a powerful enemy or earned enough respect to be taken seriously as a civilization, worthy of consideration rather than casual dismissal. The alien fleet held position, maintaining weapons lock but not firing as their commanders consulted with higher authority about how to proceed with a situation that had deviated dramatically from their expectations. Ryan Hughes reported that all systems remained operational and the ship could fight or flee, depending on the captain's assessment of the tactical situation, though everyone knew that running away now would undo everything they had just accomplished. Jake decided to wait, giving the aliens time to think about what had happened and realized that destroying the Defiant would be possible but costly in ships and personnel that the Empire might prefer to preserve by choosing negotiation over continued combat. On Valdris, Prime Emperor Thovan received reports about the engagement with growing concern because the humans had demonstrated capabilities that suggested either remarkable technological advancement or the ability to hide their true strength until the moment they chose to reveal it. The Valdrin Empire had ruled the eastern spiral arm of the galaxy for over 3,000 years, and their military might was unquestioned across hundreds of star systems where countless species bowed before their power and accepted their rule without resistance because fighting back seemed impossible against such overwhelming force that could destroy entire worlds with a single command from the Emperor himself, who sat upon his throne on the capital world called Valdris Prime, where massive towers reached toward the sky and ships came and went carrying orders to distant colonies that stretched across the darkness of space, like a web of control that never broke or weakened, no matter how far from the center it reached. Admiral Kelrus stood in the command center of Defense Station Omega 7, which was one of the largest military installations ever built by the Empire and housed over 50,000 personnel who worked day and night monitoring the borders of Imperial space, watching for any sign of threat or intrusion that might challenge the authority of Emperor Thovan, who expected absolute vigilance from his military commanders and accepted no excuses for failure, because the Empire had enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness they could exploit to strike back against the civilization that had conquered them generations ago and forced them into submission through superior technology and ruthless determination that broke the spirit of any who dared resist. Lieutenant Vexen suddenly called out from the station where dozens of screens displayed sensor data streaming in from monitoring posts scattered throughout the sector, and his voice carried a tone of confusion that made Admiral Kelrus turn his attention away from the routine reports he had been reviewing because something in the young officer's manner suggested this was not another false alarm or sensor glitch that could be dismissed with a simple recalibration command, but rather something genuinely unusual that required immediate attention from someone with experience and authority to make decisions that could affect the security of the entire border region. The sensor readings showed an unknown vessel approaching from the direction of the galactic rim where few civilizations existed, and most of those were a primitive species still struggling to achieve basic spaceflight capabilities that would allow them to reach their own moons, let alone travel between stars like the advanced races who dominated the galaxy through centuries of technological development and military conquest that established the current balance of power among the various empires and federations that carved up space into territories they defended with jealous determination against any who might challenge their claims. Admiral Kelrus examined the data carefully, noting several disturbing factors that set this contact apart from the usual encounters with merchant vessels or exploratory ships from known civilizations who followed established protocols for entering Imperial space and announced their intentions through proper channels well in advance of actually crossing the border that separated Valdrin territory from the neutral zones beyond, where no single power claimed absolute authority and ships could travel freely as long as they caused no trouble or threatened the interests of the major players, who watched those regions carefully for any signs of emerging threats. The unknown vessel was moving faster than should be possible using any known propulsion system, and the energy signature it produced matched nothing in the Imperial database that contained information on every civilization the Valdrin had encountered. Over 3 millennia of expansion and exploration that took them from their homeworld to the far reaches of the spiral arm, where they established their dominance through a combination of diplomatic skill and overwhelming military force that convinced most species that cooperation was preferable to resistance, which would only result in destruction and assimilation into the Empire as conquered subjects rather than willing allies. Communication attempts produced no response from the approaching vessel, which continued on its course without acknowledging the increasingly urgent hails being broadcast on every frequency the Empire used for contact with other spacefaring species. And this silence was deeply troubling because even hostile powers usually responded to challenges with threats or demands rather than simply ignoring attempts at communication, which suggested either a technological incompatibility that prevented the vessel from receiving messages or a deliberate choice to maintain radio silence, for reasons that could only be sinister in nature. Hours passed as the vessel drew closer and more defense stations detected its approach, adding their sensor data to the growing collection of information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of something that should not exist according to everything the Empire knew about the species inhabiting their region of space, because none of them possessed the capability to build a ship this large or move it at such incredible speeds using propulsion technology that seemed to operate on principles the Valdaran scientists could not identify from the energy signatures being detected by instruments designed to analyze every known form of faster-than-light travel. Emperor Thovan received the reports in his throne room where his war council assembled to discuss this unprecedented situation that had the potential to become either a minor curiosity or a major crisis depending on the intentions of whoever controlled the mysterious vessel that refused to identify itself or respond to the increasingly aggressive demands being broadcast by military commanders who were trained to view unknown contacts as potential threats until proven otherwise through proper identification and submission to imperial authority that guaranteed safe passage through Valdaran space for those willing to acknowledge the Emperor's sovereignty. High Admiral Korvath pulled up archived records from a survey mission conducted 7 years earlier in the Rim territories where a small exploratory vessel had encountered a primitive species, calling themselves humans who possessed only basic technology and seemed completely unaware of the great empires that dominated the civilized regions of the galaxy closer to the galactic core, where resources were abundant and life had evolved on countless worlds, creating a rich tapestry of civilizations. At various stages of development from Stone Age primitives to spacefaring powers that controlled multiple star systems, the survey team had dismissed the humans as irrelevant because their technology was centuries behind even the least advanced members of the galactic community and they posed no threat to imperial interests or security, so no further contact was deemed necessary and the location of their homeworld was noted in the database before the survey vessel moved on to catalog other species in the region who might prove more interesting or useful to the Empire in future diplomatic or military operations. Emperor Thovan studied the recorded data about humans, noting that they apparently had a history of conflict among themselves and seemed to possess an unusual drive to explore and expand despite their technological limitations, which was admirable in a way but also irrelevant because primitive species were common throughout the galaxy and most never developed beyond a certain point before either destroying themselves through war or environmental collapse or being absorbed into larger civilizations that recognized their potential as subjects or resources. The Emperor ordered the Third Fleet to intercept the unknown vessel with instructions to determine its identity and intentions through whatever means proved necessary, including force if the vessel showed any sign of hostility or refused to submit to imperial authority, which would be interpreted as an act of aggression justifying immediate military response designed to eliminate the threat before it could penetrate deeper into imperial space where it might gather intelligence or conduct reconnaissance for a larger invasion force that could be following behind. Admiral Kelris watched as 27 warships moved into position, forming a defensive formation designed to present an overwhelming show of force that would convince any rational commander to halt and negotiate rather than risk destruction. By continuing forward into what was clearly a military blockade, established by a civilization with the power and will to enforce its territorial claims against any who challenged them regardless of their reasons for entering imperial space without permission.